Hello everyone. I am Terror Meta, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now, get comfortable and relax. My name is Ethan Holloway. I'm 28 years old. This happened in the fall of last year when I, along with my best friend Josh Kim, his girlfriend Mar Dunley, and my cousin Zach Reynolds, decided to escape the constant hum of city life and take a much-needed break in the wilds of Zaleski State Forest, Ohio. I'd bought an old RV, a rickety second-hand Dodge camper that I thought would serve as a temporary home on wheels, and, despite its quirks, I was eager to put it to the test. The plan was simple: a 3-day weekend of camping, hiking, and letting the forest soothe our frayed nerves. What I didn't know was that the forest had a different plan for us. We arrived at the forest's edge on a chilly October afternoon. The sky was a soft gray, hinting at an early dusk, and the forest itself exuded an eerie tranquility. The RV rattled over the gravel turnoff, its engine coughing as it struggled up a barely marked incline. I parked near a secluded loop of the Zaleski Backpack Trail, only a mile from the ruins of an old iron furnace known locally as Hope Furnace, a remnant of a bygone era with whispers of curses and misfortune. I recalled Zach's uneasy glances when he'd mentioned those ruins, but I dismissed it as local lore. That evening, while we were setting up camp, it became immediately clear that our equipment was not entirely up to the task. The generator sputtered to life with an intermittent hum, and 2 of our flashlights blinked erratically. Mara's phone, which had been fully charged when we left Columbus, refused to hold a charge now, its screen dark and unresponsive. We exchanged uneasy looks, but with the promise of adventure and the need to escape our everyday lives, we pressed on. I spent the early hours of the night tending to a small fire near the back of the RV, while Josh joked about the strange antique setting we'd chosen. His light-hearted banter provided a welcome distraction from the creeping chill that seemed to settle among the trees. As the night deepened, I found myself alone with my thoughts, the forest around me strangely silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. And then, just as I was beginning to relax, I heard it, a long, drawn-out whistle that cut through the stillness. It was a sound that didn't belong to any bird or animal I knew. I paused mid-stir, the handle of the kettle still in my grasp, and strained my ears. The sound was hollow and low, as if someone were trying desperately to mimic a tune they'd once known. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks with the acoustics of the forest, but a shiver crawled up my spine. Later that night, as I lay in the cramped bunks of the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I recalled the odd sound again, and when I glanced out the window I thought I saw a shadow slip behind a cluster of trees. I hesitated to wake the others. Josh's soft snores filled the space, and I didn't want to disturb the tenuous calm. Instead, I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, the sound of the whistling echoing in my mind. Morning came too soon. I woke, with a lingering sense of dread and a slight headache, the early light doing little to dispel the darkness that seemed to hang over our little camp. Over a rushed breakfast, Mara confided that she'd woken up in the middle of the night with a nosebleed and a vivid dream of being dragged into the woods by that same disconcerting whistle. I tried to reassure her, attributing it to stress and the chill, but deep down, I couldn't help feeling that something was off. With the daylight strengthening, we decided to explore the area around the old furnace ruins. Zach led us, his rugged frame and weathered face lending him an air of authority when it came to surviving the backwoods. As we walked along a barely trodden path, I couldn't help noticing odd formations in the undergrowth. In a clearing not far from the ruins, we discovered small piles of stones arranged in meticulous circles, and on the bark of nearby trees were carved symbols, swirls and crosses that looked ancient, as if someone had been marking territory or offering a warning. Josh, ever the inquisitive one, pulled out his camera and snapped several photos. When we reviewed them later on his phone, the images were nothing but blank or distorted, as though something had interfered with the digital memory. The air grew heavier as the day wore on. We resumed our trek back to the RV, but the forest seemed to have shifted around us, the trees growing closer and the underbrush denser. By the time dusk began to paint the sky in deep reds and purples, the oppressive feeling had only intensified. I remember standing at the edge of the clearing, heart pounding, when that same three-note whistling returned, this time unmistakably close. The sound wasn't coming from a distance. It was as though it was circling right around us, persistent and unnerving. I glanced at Mara, whose eyes were wide with fear, and then at Josh, who forced a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. That night, as we huddled inside the RV trying to outpace our growing terror, Zach finally broke his silence. His voice, usually so steady, trembled as he recounted an old miner's tale from the Hope Furnace days. He spoke of a spirit they called the Whistler, a malevolent presence said to haunt these woods. According to local lore, the spirit was once a miner who had died in a terrible accident, buried alive under a rockslide, his soul twisted by anger and despair. In death, he had become something else, a being that mimicked sounds to lure unsuspecting travelers away from safety, to trap them in the forest's clutches. Zach warned us that if we heard the whistling more than once, it meant that the spirit had chosen us. His words chilled me to the bone, and I found myself questioning every sound in the night. Then, in a moment that defied all rational explanation, Josh slipped out of the RV. I remember being jolted awake by the sound of soft footsteps on the gravel outside, followed by a faint, desperate whisper that carried on the wind. "It wants to trade." I bolted upright and shouted for Josh to come back, but there was no response. Mara and Zach scrambled after me, and together we rushed outside into the inky darkness, flashlights trembling in our hands. We found him an hour later, huddled beneath an overhang of rock, barefoot and shivering. His eyes were vacant, as if he were somewhere else entirely. He mumbled incoherently about the whisper and the lure of the forest, words tumbling out in a half-dream, half-reality state. We helped him back to the RV, our minds reeling with the implications of what had just happened. The following day, panic and tension hung thick in the air like the low-hanging mist over the forest floor. We tried to salvage our plans, pack up our gear, get the RV started, and leave this nightmare behind. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, each attempt more futile than the last. Our route back to civilization, which we had plotted meticulously on paper, now seemed useless. Every road we attempted to follow led to dead ends or loops that circled back to the same ominous landmarks. Mara's attempt to use her phone as a GPS ended in frustration, as the screen glitched wildly and displayed nothing but a hypnotic spiral. Zach's earlier warnings echoed in my mind, and in a moment of despair, he confessed something that made my blood run cold. He told us about a friend, a fellow miner from his past, who had vanished in these very woods 2 years earlier. That friend had heard the same whistling and had been drawn into the darkness, never to be seen again. Zach's confession was laden with guilt and regret. He'd been there too once and had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. We didn't have time to dwell on his past, though, as the night approached with renewed menace. As darkness fell once more, an unnerving silence blanketed the forest. We huddled inside the RV, trying to piece together a plan to escape. But soon, a new sound shattered the uneasy quiet. A series of deliberate knocks, rhythmic and methodical, on the exterior of the RV. The knocks came in groups of 3, echoing in the cramped metal chamber. I remember gripping the edge of the table, my pulse thundering in my ears as I listened. Mara's eyes searched mine for reassurance, but I couldn't offer any. We knew then that something was outside, something that wasn't simply passing by. Then, as if the night itself had conspired against us, Josh vanished. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. Panic ensued. We discovered his phone, left behind on a table, still recording. I watched in horror as the grainy footage revealed Josh walking alone into the dark woods, his eyes glazed with a trance-like intensity. In the background, a tall, thin figure moved in a manner that defied explanation. Its limbs contorted, its form shifting, as if it were mimicking a human silhouette but with an otherworldly distortion. Josh's whispered words, "I just want to know what it is," reverberated through the recording, mingling with the unsettling sound of the whistle that seemed to intensify with each step he took. I felt a crushing mix of anger, guilt, and fear. How could we have been so foolish? How had a simple RV trip turned into this waking nightmare? With a heavy heart, Mara, Zach, and I decided to follow the trail into the woods, determined to find Josh before it was too late. We retraced his path through the twisted undergrowth, our flashlights cutting weak beams through the darkness. It wasn't long before we found a haunting sight. Josh's shirt, inexplicably suspended from a low branch, swaying slightly in the cool breeze. The sight of it made my stomach churn, a grim reminder that whatever was out there had already begun to claim its victims. That night, the forest seemed to close in on us. We set up a makeshift camp away from the RV, fearing that staying inside might somehow invite the horror to follow us. Sleep was elusive. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig had our hearts racing. I took turns keeping watch, my eyes darting around in the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature that had stolen our friend. At one point, I swore I saw a figure among the trees, a shape that bore an uncanny resemblance to Josh, yet with an expression twisted into something unrecognizable. The figure stood there, silent, its eyes reflecting the dim light before it slowly faded into the shadows. I screamed, and in that moment, reality and nightmare collided. Mara's voice broke the silence as she tried to soothe me, but the damage was done. We all knew that the forest was no longer our sanctuary. It had become a labyrinth of terror, where nothing was as it seemed. The next morning brought no relief. The oppressive atmosphere lingered like a thick fog, and the weight of our losses was palpable. Determined to leave, we tried once more to start the RV, but it remained stubbornly lifeless. Every attempt at repairing our route seemed futile, as though the forest itself was conspiring to trap us. In a desperate bid to understand our situation, Zach confided more of his troubled past, a confession that chilled us to the core. He recalled a time when, as a young man working near these very ruins, he had encountered the legend of the Whistler. He described the spirit as a tormented soul born from a miner's untimely death, twisted by the isolation and despair of his final moments. According to Zach, this malevolent entity had the power to mimic sounds, especially that haunting whistle, and would prey on those who dared venture too close to its domain. His words, heavy with regret and sorrow, left us with little comfort as we faced the reality of our situation. That night, a new terror emerged. As we huddled in the darkness near the dead RV, the silence was abruptly shattered by a series of knocks, once again in 3 distinct, deliberate beats. The sound was not merely a knock, but a summons, as if the very forest was calling out to us. I could feel my heart pounding so fiercely that I was sure everyone could hear it. The knocks echoed off the metal walls of our temporary refuge, each one resonating with an unspoken promise of doom. We clutched each other, waiting for the inevitable, and in those long minutes of paralyzing terror I realized that the entity was not just a distant presence, but something that had infiltrated our immediate world. The night unfolded into chaos. In a moment of sheer panic, we decided to make a break for it. But before we could even muster the strength to move, the horror escalated in ways that defied explanation. The RV, which had served as our supposed safe haven, suddenly became the stage for a nightmare. Without warning, the interior lights flickered violently and then burst into a dazzling flare. In that harsh glare, I saw shadows moving with a life of their own, and voices, whispers, laughter, and mournful cries filled the confined space. I could hear Mara scream, her voice echoing with a terror that resonated deep within my soul. In the midst of this chaos, a force, as if guided by an unseen hand, yanked at Mara, lifting her upward through the skylight of the RV. I reached out, desperate to grab her, but the space between us expanded, as if time itself were slowing down. Her final scream, a mixture of agony and disbelief, still rings in my ears. I woke up sometime later, alone, with the echo of that unholy whistle haunting my every thought. Zach had vanished sometime during the tumult, leaving no trace behind. I was the sole survivor now, trapped in a labyrinth of fear and despair. The forest was no longer a place of refuge. It was a living, breathing entity that had claimed my friends and shown no mercy. With nothing left to lose, I grabbed my journal and began to write down every detail, every moment of horror, in the hope that someone might one day understand what had happened here. I spent the next day wandering the forest, my mind a tumult of grief, anger, and an overwhelming sense of dread. The paths twisted in on themselves. Familiar landmarks had become distorted and unrecognizable. I tried to retrace my steps back to the RV, but the forest seemed intent on confusing me, its canopy blocking out any semblance of sunlight. Every rustle in the brush, every snap of a twig made me jump, as though the forest itself were alive and hunting me. As dusk fell again, I realized that escape was a fantasy. I found a small clearing and set up a makeshift camp, knowing that sleep would bring only nightmares. In the dark, I could almost hear Mara's soft voice reciting the protective chants her grandmother had taught her. For a brief moment, it felt like the forest held its breath, and the ominous whistling faded into a reluctant silence. But then, just as I was beginning to cling to that fleeting hope, the sound returned, this time louder, closer, as if it were right behind me. I could feel the presence before I saw it, a cold, oppressive force that pressed against my back, making it nearly impossible to move. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body tense, and there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the figure. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs oddly elongated, and its face was shrouded in shadow. For an agonizing moment, I thought I recognized something in its form, perhaps a faint echo of Josh's features. But the resemblance was twisted beyond recognition. The creature lifted a bony hand, and with an unearthly, resonant whistle, it advanced. I could no longer discern whether the sound was meant to lure me or simply to terrify me. Desperation took over as I ran blindly through the forest, the relentless whistle echoing behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs threatening to give out as I stumbled over uneven ground and tangled roots. I recalled Zach's words about the spirit's need to feed on fear, to trap souls in this forsaken place, and I fought to suppress the terror that threatened to overwhelm me. In a frantic haze, I pushed onward, hoping to find some semblance of safety or a way out. Every step felt like wading through thick, unseen hands, every sound amplified until it merged into a cacophony of horror. I eventually found a narrow, overgrown trail that seemed to lead upward. Clambering up, I could see the fading light of dusk give way to a starless night. The oppressive darkness was complete, broken only by the occasional flicker of my failing flashlight. I could still hear the distant whistling, now a constant companion, rather than a sporadic threat. With every step, the forest whispered its ancient secrets, and I wondered if I was becoming part of its legend. I reached a clearing near the top of a small hill, where I collapsed against a fallen log. I fumbled for my journal, desperate to record every detail so that if I ever made it out alive, someone would know what truly happened here. My hand shook as I scribbled down the final moments. Mara's screams, Zach's silence, and the unyielding echo of that terrible, otherworldly whistle. The forest seemed to lean in closer as I wrote, as if it were absorbing every word, every confession of fear and regret. In that moment of solitude, the forest's presence was palpable. I sensed that I was not alone, that somewhere in the dark, unseen branches, the malevolent force watched me with unblinking intent. My thoughts raced, a whirlwind of memories and regrets. I remembered the excitement that had brought us here, the promise of adventure and the allure of the unknown. Now, that same unknown had consumed my friends and threatened to claim my soul as well. I tried to gather the remnants of my courage. I reminded myself of all the survival skills I'd learned over the years, of how, even in the worst circumstances, one could find a way out. Yet, as the night deepened and the shadows around me seemed to pulse with an unholy life, I felt an overwhelming sense of futility. The forest was vast and unyielding, a labyrinth of despair with no exit. As the hours dragged on, I became hyper-aware of every sound. The steady, relentless whistle, a triad of notes that seemed to punctuate the silence, haunted my every thought. I thought I heard it right behind me, then in front of me, always just out of sight. At one point, I dared to look over my shoulder and caught a glimpse of movement, a dark silhouette merging with the shadows. I couldn't tell if it was the creature or a trick of the light, but it was enough to send me spiraling into a panic I could barely control. I began to chant the protective words Mara had mentioned earlier, clinging to the hope that some ancient magic might shield me from the malevolent force stalking me. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though the power of those words pushed back the darkness and the whistling receded to a distant murmur. But then, with a sudden, violent gust of wind, the spell was broken. The sound of the whistle exploded, around me once more insistent and angry than ever before. I ran again, heart pounding, muscles burning, and mind clouded with a blend of terror and determination. The forest became a blur of indistinct shapes and twisting branches. I don't recall how long I ran, only that my legs felt like lead and my lungs burned with each desperate breath. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing where the derelict remains of an old stone wall hinted at a long-forgotten boundary, a relic of a time when this land was governed by human hands. Here, in the silent ruins, I paused to catch my breath, every sense on high alert. In that brief interlude, I thought I heard footsteps approaching. I held my breath and pressed myself against the cold stone, every fiber of my being screaming, in silent alarm. The whistling was quieter now, as though the creature was biding its time. In that moment of paralyzing uncertainty, I realized that the forest was not only a physical labyrinth, but also a realm where time and space twisted in unpredictable ways. My thoughts returned to my lost friends, Josh, Mara, and Zach, each of them victims of this relentless supernatural force that seemed determined to tear us apart. I forced myself to move again, determined not to succumb to despair. I made my way back toward the direction where I believed the RV might be, hoping that the relic of our former sanctuary might provide some shelter. When I finally reached the site, the RV sat there like a tomb, its doors ajar and the interior bathed in an eerie, intermittent glow from the failing generator. My heart sank as I stepped inside. It was clear that whatever had been inside had not left quietly. Scattered belongings, broken flashlights, and the faint, lingering smell of fear filled the space. I found a bundle of personal items that once belonged to Josh, a small worn cap and a photograph of the four of us smiling on a brighter day. The stark contrast between that memory and the present horror was almost too much to bear. I retreated to a corner of the RV and began to write down everything in my journal, knowing that if I didn't get out of this cursed place, someone, somewhere, needed to know what had happened. As I wrote, I could almost feel the eyes of the forest upon me, judging, waiting, and hungry. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the intermittent, ghostly whistling that had now become the rhythm of my nightmare. Time lost meaning as I waited for dawn that never truly came. In the dark hours, I heard whispers that I could barely decipher, snatches of voices that seemed to echo fragments of our lost conversations, mixed with unfamiliar guttural tones. My mind, exhausted and frayed at the edges, began to blur the line between reality and hallucination. I thought I saw Mara, her eyes pleading for help, flickering at the edge of my vision. I heard Zach's deep, gravelly voice warning me, even though I knew he was gone. The forest, it seemed, was reassembling the pieces of our lives, a macabre tapestry of memory and loss. Then, as if the final act of this hellish play had begun, the RV shuddered with a force that knocked me off my feet. The walls vibrated with the rhythm of that dreadful whistle, and I felt an invisible pressure pushing against me, as if the very air were trying to crush my resolve. In that terrifying moment, I realized that the creature was not simply an external force. It was an integral part of this cursed land, woven into its history and its very fabric. The spirit, born from despair and anger, had claimed these woods long ago, and now it sought to claim all who dared trespass upon its territory. My name is Tyler Bennett, and I'm 34 years old. This happened last autumn at Salt Fork State Park in Ohio, a place that holds memories as bitter as they are mysterious. I returned alone, driven by a need to face the ghosts of my past and, perhaps, finally understand the strange legends that have haunted me since I was a boy. I'm a photographer and an amateur cryptozoologist, always chasing the elusive and the unexplained. But nothing prepared me for what I would encounter that fateful weekend. I pulled my RV into a quiet, isolated campground near the shores of Salt Fork Lake. The chill of late autumn seeped into my bones as I drove along winding roads lined with trees that had shed most of their leaves. The air carried a dampness that mingled with an unspoken heaviness, a kind of melancholy that seemed to have clung to this place for decades. I chose a spot right by the lake, the very same shoreline that holds the memory of my younger sister, Eliza, who drowned mysteriously when I was just 13. The guilt, sorrow, and unanswered questions of that day had driven me back here, seeking solace and perhaps a hint of closure. I unloaded my advanced equipment, a DSLR rig with a set of high-quality lenses, a drone for aerial shots, and several recorders to capture any unusual sounds. Even with all this technology, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. The RV was my sanctuary, albeit a mobile one, and as I set up camp, I noticed that my devices seemed to lose charge more quickly than usual. I chalked it up to my own distracted state, grappling with memories of Eliza and the heavy atmosphere of the place, but a small part of me wondered if the environment was interfering with my gadgets. That first night was a quiet one, marked by the soft lapping of water against the shore and the rustle of wind through the trees. I set up my camera traps along the lakeside, focusing on the areas locals whispered about, the parts where, according to legend, the lake children were said to appear. The stories described them as spectral figures, tiny and pale, with eyes that shone like wet stones under moonlight. I couldn't help but feel a chill when I recalled how my parents had dismissed those tales as mere folklore. Yet, as darkness enveloped the camp, the silence was broken by something unexpected. A faint, distant laughter, high-pitched and childlike, that seemed to echo from the depths of the lake. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The sound was clear enough to be real, but so ethereal that it could have been nothing more than the wind playing tricks on my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, fueled by memories of Eliza's laughter, a sound that once filled our home with life before tragedy struck. But the sound persisted, growing slightly louder and more insistent as the night wore on. I double-checked my equipment, only to find that my battery levels were inexplicably lower than when I'd left home, and one of my recorders had shut down on its own. The chill that ran down my spine wasn't solely due to the autumn air. It was something else, a creeping dread that whispered of things beyond human understanding. The following morning, I awoke to a dense fog hovering over the lake. I stepped outside and noticed something even more unsettling, a series of small, bare, Footprints encircled my RV, leading directly to the water's edge before vanishing abruptly. My instincts screamed that these were not animal tracks, nor were they the play of a child I might have encountered. I took several photos, each one a testament to the strange, almost ritualistic pattern they formed. The images, however, were overexposed and blurred, as if the very act of capturing them on film was thwarted by an unseen force. Throughout the day, I moved methodically along the lakeshore, trying to reconcile my scientific skepticism with the raw, visceral experiences of the night. I found no concrete evidence of anything supernatural, only the oppressive feeling of being watched and the occasional whisper of wind that sounded eerily like faint giggles. I couldn't help but recall the local lore, stories passed down among those who'd grown up near Salt Fork, stories of ghostly children luring unsuspecting souls into the water. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my return was not just about confronting my grief. It was about confronting a dark, persistent legend that had seeped into the very fabric of this place. As dusk began to fall that afternoon, the air grew colder and the sky took on a bruised purple hue. I set my tripod near a cluster of trees that bordered the lake, determined to capture the haunting interplay of shadow and light. That's when I saw her, a small figure standing at the water's edge. For a moment I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I recognized the outline of a little girl with long dark hair. My heart skipped a beat. I approached slowly, my camera at the ready, but when I reached the spot where I'd seen her, she was gone. In her place were only ripples on the lake, gentle and undisturbed, as if a stone had been thrown into the water. I was left with a single, burning question. Was that an apparition or a manifestation of my own tortured memories? That evening, as night swallowed the land once again, I sat in the RV reviewing the footage I had captured. My hands trembled as I played back the clips, desperate to find some rational explanation. Instead, I found fleeting images of blurry silhouettes near the water, tiny shapes that moved in a manner too deliberate to be mere chance. One clip in particular made my blood run cold. In it, a small group of figures could be seen gathered at the shoreline, their eyes reflecting an uncanny light. I attempted to enhance the image on my laptop, but it crashed repeatedly, erasing any hope of clarity. The recurring malfunctions of my equipment were no longer a coincidence. They were a sinister part of this unfolding nightmare. Sleep eluded me that night as I lay awake, haunted by memories of Eliza and the soft, haunting whispers that seemed to call my name. I heard them clearly, a mix of laughter and crying, as if children were playing and weeping simultaneously. At times, I swore I heard Eliza's voice among them, a sound so familiar it both comforted and terrified me. I clutched a faded photograph of her smile frozen in a time when life was simpler and the world was safe. Instead, now, that same smile was twisted into something almost otherworldly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn back into a past I desperately wanted to escape. The next day, I resolved to dig deeper. I spent hours scouring old local records and archived newspapers on my laptop, uncovering chilling accounts of unexplained drownings and mysterious disappearances around Salt Fork Lake. Reports spoke of children being lured to the water by voices, calling out to them, of families haunted by inexplicable tragedies that left communities in mourning. I learned that Eliza's death, too, had always been shrouded in unanswered questions. No clear cause, no definitive explanation, just an overwhelming sense of loss and inexplicable fear. With every piece of research, my determination defined. The truth grew, even as the weight of my past threatened to crush me. That evening, as twilight deepened into night, the phenomenon escalated. I was outside the RV, setting up another camera along a different angle of the lakeshore, when I distinctly heard a soft voice, a child's voice, whispering, "Come play with us." It wasn't a sound I could ignore. It was both inviting and terrifying in its intensity. I spun around, my heart hammering, and caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there, only the dark, endless stretch of the lake and the dense trees that bordered it. I shuddered, feeling as if I were teetering on the brink of a revelation that I was both eager and terrified to confront. The night grew oppressive, and as I sat huddled inside the RV, I began to hear faint tapping on the exterior walls. It was rhythmic, persistent, and unmistakably deliberate. I pressed my ear against the cold metal, trying to discern if it was the wind or something more sinister. In that moment, my mind raced back to the warnings I'd heard in whispers from local residents, tales of ghostly children whose laughter masked a deeper, malevolent intent. I could feel the presence of something beyond the tangible, something that had been waiting in the shadows for a chance to break free. Then, in a moment that defied explanation, I saw her. I don't know if it was the product of my frayed nerves or an actual apparition, but I was certain of one thing. Standing at the window of my RV was a small figure. A girl, pale and drenched as if she'd been submerged in water. Her eyes were empty, yet they held a profound sadness, and for an agonizing moment I was certain it was Eliza. I wanted to scream, to call out to her, but my throat was paralyzed by a terror I couldn't name. The figure lingered for just a few heartbeats before vanishing into the inky darkness, leaving behind an echo of a plea that I struggled to decipher. I spent the next day in a state of delirium, torn between the need to document every supernatural detail and the overwhelming terror that gripped me with each passing minute. I set out along the shoreline, my camera slung around my neck like a lifeline, determined to capture evidence of what I was witnessing. The fog was thicker than before, wrapping the lake in a ghostly veil. I advanced cautiously, every step measured, and heavy with dread. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, and soft, indistinct whispers brushed against my ears like a lullaby from a nightmare. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. Small, delicate steps that did not match any living child's gait. I turned abruptly, and for a fleeting moment, I caught sight of a little girl in a white dress. Her hair dark and matted, her eyes, too, large and too sorrowful for her small face. She stood at the water's edge, beckoning silently with a hand that trembled. I approached slowly, my instincts telling me to run. Yet a deeper, inexplicable need to understand compelled me forward. As I neared her, she turned and darted away into the mist, leaving only the impression of bare footprints in the soft earth. I followed them, desperate to bridge the gap between memory and reality, only to find that the footprints led directly into the lake and vanished beneath the surface. That was the moment I understood. The lake itself was a threshold between the world of the living and something far darker. Every discovery I made, every malfunctioning device, every ghostly whisper seemed to conspire to pull me deeper into a realm where the past and the supernatural intertwined. The weight of my grief, the unresolved guilt over Eliza's untimely death, pressed in on me with a relentless intensity, making every moment feel like a descent into madness. Night fell once again, and this time I decided I couldn't remain confined to the RV. I ventured back to the lake shore, driven by a desperate need to confront whatever force was luring me into its depths. The darkness was absolute, punctuated only by the pale glow of the moon and the trembling beam of my flashlight. As I reached the water's edge, I heard a soft, almost musical giggle, a sound that could only belong to a child. I turned, and there, illuminated by the moonlight, stood a figure I could hardly believe. It was a young girl, her back to me, her dark hair streaming like ink in the night. For an agonizing moment, I thought it was Eliza. Her familiar silhouette softened by the spectral light, but as I drew closer, the features became grotesquely distorted. A face that bore a haunting resemblance to my sister, but twisted into something unearthly and sorrowful. She extended a small hand toward me, and in a voice that was both tender and accusatory, she whispered, "Join us." The words shattered what little rationality I had left. Behind her, I began to see more figures emerging from the lake, dozens of pale, sorrowful faces of children, their eyes reflecting the cold light of the moon as they silently beckoned me closer. The water churned softly, as if stirred by an unseen hand, and the ghostly chorus of faint laughter and weeping filled the air. In that climactic moment, I felt an overwhelming surge of terror and longing, a desperate tug between the desire to escape and the compulsion to heed the call of the lost souls that haunted this place. I tried to step back, to retreat into the relative safety of my RV, but the pull was too strong. The spectral figures began to close in, their forms merging with the darkness in a slow, inexorable embrace. I could see the agony in their eyes, the same anguish I had felt all those years ago, and I realized with a sickening clarity that these were the children of the lake, lost souls trapped between life and death, doomed to wander the murky waters for eternity. I summoned every ounce of strength, shaking off the overwhelming despair, and staggered away from the water's edge. My heart pounded as I ran back through the forest, the ghostly laughter echoing behind me like a sinister lullaby. Branches clawed at my skin, and the biting cold was relentless, but I didn't dare stop. I could still hear that voice, Eliza's voice, pleading, mournful, calling me back. With every step, I fought to reclaim my sense of self, determined not to let the spectral children drag me into their watery grave. I reached the RV in a state of near hysterics, fumbling with the keys as if my life depended on it. Once inside, I locked the doors and bolted them, the metallic clamor echoing in the suffocating silence. I collapsed onto a threadbare couch, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from the confrontation. The images of those ghostly faces burned into my vision, and I knew that the lake and its haunted children had marked me forever. The night wore on in a restless haze. I sat by the small window, unable to tear my eyes from the dark water, waiting for dawn with a mixture of dread and reluctant hope. In the hours before morning, the RV trembled as if struck by an unseen force. The lights flickered, and for brief instants, I thought I saw tiny handprints appear on the glass, small, wet marks that disappeared as quickly as they formed. I could no longer tell if these were remnants of my own fear-induced hallucinations or real signs of a presence that had infiltrated my refuge. As the first hints of light began to creep across the sky, I gathered the shattered pieces of my resolve. I knew I had to leave Salt Fork State Park to escape the grip of the haunted lake and its spectral denizens. Yet, even as I started the RV, miraculously sputtering to life after a night of utter terror, I felt the lingering pull of that sorrowful, malevolent force. I drove slowly along the desolate roads, the early morning fog clinging to the windshield like a shroud. Every mile felt like a small victory, yet each turn of the wheel was haunted by the memory of those ghostly children and the final, anguished plea of my sister. I don't know how long I drove before I finally saw signs of civilization, a small town emerging from the gloom, its neon lights a weak promise of normalcy. By that time, I was exhausted, my spirit battered by the relentless encounter with the supernatural. I pulled over at a modest motel on the outskirts of town and collapsed onto a bed, the events of the past days replaying in my mind in vivid, unyielding detail. In the haze of a troubled sleep, I dreamt of Eliza, of her smiling face, of the sound of her laughter mingling with the voices of the lake children. In my dreams, she reached out to me, her eyes pleading for me to come back, to join her in that eternal sorrowful dance by the water's edge. I awoke in a cold sweat, the remnants of that dream clinging to me like a second skin. I realized then that my encounter with the lake's haunted legacy wasn't over. It had left an indelible mark on my soul, a reminder that some wounds never fully heal. Even now, as I write these words in a journal that trembles in my hands, I can still hear that faint, unrelenting laughter and the soft, mournful whispers of children lost to the depths. Salt Fork State Park remains a scar on my memory, a place where the boundary between life and death blurs into a chilling haze. I escaped with my body intact, but my heart, my very soul, bears the weight of what I experienced there. I have learned that grief and guilt can open doors to places we never knew existed, realms where the lost linger and the innocent are ensnared by a force beyond our comprehension. My journey back to Salt Fork was meant to be a confrontation with my past, a chance to exorcise the demons that had haunted me for decades. Instead, it unveiled a horror more profound and sorrowful than I could have ever imagined, a legacy of tragedy, where the echoes of lost lives call out in the darkness, drawing the unsuspecting into a cycle of despair. Every time I close my eyes, I see the pale faces of the lake children, and I hear that whispered invitation. Come play with us. I know now that some forces are eternal, that the past never truly dies, but rather lingers in the quiet corners of the world, waiting for a chance to resurface. I still struggle with the knowledge that my own history is intertwined with that haunted shore, that the sorrow of Eliza's untimely death and the mysterious legends of Salt Fork are inseparable. And while I have left the park behind, I carry its dark secrets with me, a reminder of the fragile boundary between reality and the supernatural. I continue my work as a photographer and seeker of truth, but nothing I capture on film can fully convey the terror and the profound sadness I experienced by that lake. Instead, I share my story with those who will listen, hoping that my cautionary tale may prevent someone else from wandering too close to the edge of that sorrowful realm. For in the depths of Salt Fork, beneath the gentle ripples of the water and the mournful whisper of the wind, lie the shattered dreams of children and the broken heart of a sister who never truly left. I know that I will never be the same again. The haunted laughter, the ghostly footsteps, and the spectral pleas of those lost souls have woven themselves into the tapestry of my existence. And though I have found a way to live with the memories, there are moments, quiet, solitary moments, when I feel the pull of the lake, a gentle, irresistible tug that promises both solace and damnation. I remain ever vigilant, aware that the past is never far behind, and that sometimes the price of uncovering the truth is a lifetime of quiet, lingering terror. This is my confession, a chronicle of grief, obsession, and the relentless pursuit of truth in a world where the veil between the living and the lost is disturbingly thin. Salt Fork State Park will forever echo with the voices of those who never returned, and in that echo, I hear my sister's soft, sorrowful call. I survived, yes, but I carry the legacy of that haunted shore with me, a reminder that some tragedies are eternal, and some voices, no matter how faint, will always call us back to the depths. And so, I continue to live with the memory of that autumn, with the lingering images of pale, ghostly children and the unmistakable, heart-wrenching plea of a sister lost to time. I am Tyler Bennett, forever marked by the secrets of Salt Fork, and I know that as long as there are those who dare to remember, the echoes of the lake will never truly fade away. My name is David Rowan, and I'm 38 years old. This happened in the fall of last year when I desperately needed to escape the relentless pressure of my job as an ER nurse, a job that, despite its noble calling, had begun to crush me under the weight of regret and guilt. I had lost a young woman named Jessie in my care, a loss I've never forgiven myself for, and I believed that a long solitary retreat in the wilderness might help me find some measure of solace, or, at the very least, force me to confront the demons that haunted my every waking moment. I arrived at Wildcat Hollow Trail, deep within Wayne National Forest in Ohio, in my old RV, a battered, converted vehicle that had become both my refuge and my escape. The moment I pulled into the remote, nearly forgotten campground near the trailhead, I was struck by an unsettling silence. There were no chirping birds or the rustle of small animals. Instead, an eerie hush enveloped the woods, as if nature itself were holding its breath. The isolation was exactly what I sought. but as I parked and stepped out into the cool autumn air, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had entered a place where time and reality had lost their meaning. Eager to immerse myself in the forest, I spent the first day hiking along the narrow, winding trails. The trees stood like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching skyward, and a thick mist clung to the forest floor. Not long after I began my walk, I noticed an odd sight. An old, rusted horseshoe hammered into the trunk of a twisted oak, its metal worn and bent and placed there upside down. Beside it lay a bundle of twigs, arranged in a deliberate figure-8 pattern. I chuckled to myself, assuming it must be the handiwork of some local prankster or the remnants of a long-forgotten folk ritual. Yet, as I continued down the trail, an inexplicable sensation of being watched settled over me, a prickling awareness at the back of my neck that I couldn't quite explain. That evening, back at the RV, I tried to shake off the day's peculiarities as I prepared a modest dinner. The isolation was meant to be therapeutic, a break from the relentless clamor of the hospital. But as night fell and darkness swallowed the landscape, I became increasingly aware of subtle, unnerving sounds. There was a soft scratching on the roof of the RV, a noise that seemed to come and go in the depths of the night. I stepped outside with my flashlight, scanning the black expanse of the forest, but found nothing beyond the rustling of leaves stirred by the autumn wind. Returning inside, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than a trick of the wind, or perhaps a stray branch tapping the roof. However, sleep did not come easily. In the grip of a vivid, unsettling dream, I found myself back in the chaotic corridors of the ER. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and there, standing before me in a surreal tableau, was Jessie. Her eyes, vacant and accusing, met mine as she whispered in a voice that chilled me to the core, "You left the door open." I awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, heart hammering in my chest. The words echoed in my mind with a resonance that went far beyond the realm of nightmares. I wondered if my grief and guilt had somehow conjured this spectral visitation, or if it was something else. A warning, perhaps, from forces I had long dismissed as mere superstition. Determined to find answers, or at least distract myself from my inner torment, I set out the following morning to explore deeper into the forest. I laced up my hiking boots, packed a small bag with essentials, and left the relative safety of my RV behind. The morning fog was thick, swirling around the base of the trees in ghostly tendrils. My GPS device, which usually provided comforting directions, spun uselessly on the forest floor, as if confused by the very fabric of this place. I soon noticed that no matter which path I took, I was inexorably drawn back to the same spot, a moss-covered stump crowned with a solitary crow skull. The skull's empty eye sockets seemed to stare into my soul, silently accusing me of trespassing where I did not belong. While navigating these disorienting trails, I encountered a man unlike any I'd seen before. He emerged from the mist as if conjured by the forest itself, old, ragged, and shrouded in an aura of despair. His clothes were tattered, and his eyes held a haunted look that made my skin crawl. Clutching a small rabbit's foot in his weathered hand, he fixed me with a penetrating stare and in a voice that was barely above a whisper said, "She doesn't want you here." Before I could muster any questions or challenge his cryptic warning, he shuffled away into the fog, disappearing as mysteriously as he had appeared. His words echoed in my mind long after our brief encounter, intensifying the feeling that I was not alone in these cursed woods. That evening, when I returned to the RV, I attempted to dismiss the day's unsettling experiences. I locked the doors and sat by a small flickering lamp, trying to focus on the simplicity of routine. But as I prepared for bed, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. A series of tiny, muddy handprints smeared on the back window of the RV. They were delicate, far too small to belong to an adult, and not like any animal tracks I had ever seen. I stared at them in disbelief, my mind racing to understand how these mysterious marks could have appeared overnight. The old man's words, the eerie symbols on the trail, and now these handprints all seemed to conspire together, warning me of a presence that defied explanation. That night, sleep proved even more elusive than before. My dreams became a twisted replay of my worst memories. Once again, I found myself back in the sterile, blinding corridors of the ER. This time, Jessie appeared with a horrifying new detail. Her chest wound had reopened, oozing dark, viscous blood. Her eyes, filled with a sorrow so profound it almost broke me, met mine as she whispered, "You were too slow." I awoke with a strangled cry, my body drenched in cold sweat and my heart aching with a pain I thought I had long buried. As I lay there in the dark silence of the RV, I noticed muddy footprints inside the door, leading away from my bed and disappearing into the shadows of the narrow hallway. Every fiber of my being screamed that these were not mere hallucinations born of grief, but tangible signs that something unnatural was at work. In the days that followed, the forest continued to reveal its dark secrets. While on a solitary hike, one afternoon I began noticing strange marks on my skin. At first, they were faint, almost like the scars of a forgotten childhood scrape. But soon I realized these marks were something far more sinister. Intricate symbols that mirrored those I had seen etched into the bark of trees along the trail. The patterns were alien and archaic, as if they were drawn by a hand that belonged to another age. They didn't bleed, but they burned with a dull, persistent ache, a reminder that the forest was marking me in a way that defied natural explanation. Late one afternoon, a violent storm suddenly descended upon the woods. The sky split with searing lightning, and the wind roared like 1,000 anguished voices. Amid the chaotic symphony of nature's fury, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing motionless at the very edge of the forest, a woman in a long, flowing, black dress. Her face was pallid, almost luminous in the intermittent flashes of lightning, and her eyes were dark, like endless voids that seemed to suck in every bit of light. I blinked, and when the next bolt of lightning illuminated the landscape, she was gone. The mere sight of her sent a surge of terror through me, yet it also stirred something deep inside, a recognition of the forces beyond my understanding. That night, as I lay awake in my RV, unable to shake the images of the storm and the spectral woman, a voice began to speak softly in the silence. It was faint at first, a mere whisper that could have been the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was unmistakably clear, a voice that carried the tone and cadence of Jessie's own, yet imbued with an otherworldly echo. "This forest doesn't forgive," it intoned, the words resonating deep within me. I sat up, heart pounding, and tried to convince myself that the voice was a product of my own guilt and sorrow, a fragmented memory from the past. But the sound persisted, mingling with the creaks and groans of the settling RV, and I knew that what I was experiencing was far beyond the realm of normal grief. Desperation and a growing need for understanding drove me to confront the horrifying memories I had long suppressed. I recalled that fateful night when I froze in the ER, the moment of paralysis that cost Jessie her life. The crushing guilt of that failure had haunted me for years, and now it seemed the forest demanded that I face it head-on. The more I struggled to ignore the signs, the more they intensified. The mysterious symbols on my skin pulsed with a subtle glow, as if they were alive, marking me as one who carried a burden too heavy to bear. It became clear that the malevolent force in these woods was not content with merely haunting me. It sought to make me atone for my past. In the midst of this overwhelming terror, a realization dawned on me. I was being drawn into the realm of the Witch of Wildcat Hollow, a legend born from Appalachian folklore, a spectral presence said to dwell in these very woods. According to the stories whispered by locals, she was a woman who had once been scorned by fate and forced into isolation, her anger and sorrow transforming her into a vengeful spirit. She was known to command the forest, manipulate dreams and time, and punish those who brought death and despair into her domain. And now, it seemed, I had become one of her chosen. With my heart pounding in my chest and a mixture of terror and reluctant determination surging within me, I knew that the only way to break free of this nightmare was to confront the witch head-on. I gathered my scattered courage and resolved to leave the relative safety of my RV, to search for the place where the witch resided, a cabin said to appear only to those who are fated to face their inner demons. The journey ahead was uncertain and fraught with disorientation. The forest itself seemed intent on twisting my path, drawing me into circles with no escape. Every step along the mossy, leaf-strewn ground felt like a descent into madness, each shadow whispering remnants of a past I could no longer ignore. The deeper I ventured, the more the forest revealed its uncanny power. Time and space began to blur. The familiar landmarks I had noted earlier transformed into bizarre, unrecognizable shapes. I kept encountering the same moss-covered stump crowned with a crow skull, as if the forest were marking my progress with a cruel sense of inevitability. The disembodied voice of Jesse grew louder in my mind, intermingling with the rustle of leaves and the distant howls of the wind. It was as if every sound, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye was a reminder of the price I had paid, a price that I could no longer escape. After what felt like an eternity of wandering under a shroud of thick, suffocating fog, I finally came upon a small clearing where the trees parted to reveal a dilapidated cabin. It was an old structure, its weathered wood and broken windows barely holding together, yet there was an undeniable pull in its presence, a magnetic draw that beckoned me closer. The door hung slightly ajar, as though inviting me into a place where my fate awaited. My pulse raced as I stepped forward, every instinct screaming to flee, even as I knew this was the moment I had been dreading. Inside the cabin, darkness reigned. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and damp wood, and every surface was cloaked in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Yet, amid the desolation, I could feel an undercurrent of energy, a presence that permeated the very walls of the room. As I moved cautiously further inside, I began to notice something strange. Every mirror and window seemed to reflect not just my own image, but fragments of memories long buried. I saw flashes of the ER, of Jesse lying on a gurney with an expression of resigned sorrow, and of my own face, frozen in shock and despair. The images played out in the reflections as if time had folded in on itself, merging past and present into a single, haunting tableau. Then came the moment that shattered the fragile boundary between memory and nightmare. In the dim light, a voice spoke, soft and sorrowful, yet laced with an undeniable authority. It was the voice of the witch, yet it carried the unmistakable cadence of Jesse's own. "You finally opened the door," the voice said, resonating through the silent cabin like a decree. In that instant, fear and a strange relief mingled within me. I sank into an old, creaking chair, my hands trembling uncontrollably, and allowed myself to speak, to confess the hidden truths that had festered in the depths of my soul for so long. I poured out my confession in a shaky whisper, recounting every detail of that fateful night in the ER, the moment I had hesitated, and the crushing guilt that had haunted me ever since. I admitted that I had frozen when I should have acted, that my inaction had cost Jessie her life. With each word, I felt as though a heavy burden was being lifted, even as the oppressive silence of the cabin bore witness to my confession. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The spectral presence seemed to listen, absorbing every syllable of my painful admission. As I finished speaking, I sensed the temperature drop further, and a subtle movement in the corner of my eye caught my attention. There, emerging from the shadows, stood the spectral figure of a woman in a long, black dress. Her face was pale and ethereal, her eyes deep voids that held centuries of sorrow. In her gaze, I saw reflected all the pain and regret that I had long tried to bury. Without a word, she regarded me, her silence speaking volumes of the ancient, unyielding judgment of the forest. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, caught in the stillness of that haunted moment. Then, as if acknowledging the truth in my confession, the figure began to fade, her presence dissolving like mist in the morning sun. In that instant, I felt a strange calm seep into me, a sensation as if I had finally been absolved of the guilt that had plagued me for so long. With cautious hope, I rose from the chair and stepped back outside. The forest, which had seemed suffocating and malevolent just moments before, now felt strangely serene. I climbed back into my RV, and to my amazement, the engine roared to life as if acknowledging my newfound resolve. The gas meter spun normally, and I realized with a mix of relief and wonder that I was free to leave. Driving away from Wildcat Hollow, I could feel the oppressive weight of guilt lifting with every mile that separated me from those haunted woods. As I merged onto a lonely highway and the dense forest gradually gave way to open land, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the trees, I caught a glimpse of a woman in a long black dress, her form fading slowly as though she were being absorbed back into the forest. I knew then that while I might leave these woods behind, the memory of what had transpired would remain with me, a silent reminder of the night I faced my demons and found a path toward redemption. I still work as an ER nurse, and every so often, in the quiet moments between shifts, I remember that fateful journey. The ghost of my guilt no longer haunts me with the same intensity, replaced instead by a deep, reflective sorrow and an understanding that some wounds can only be healed by facing them head-on. I drive now with a steady resolve, knowing that, even in the darkest corners of our lives, there is the possibility of light if we have the courage to confront our past. In the stillness of the night, when the wind whispers through the trees or the rain taps softly on my window, I sometimes hear a faint voice, a gentle, sorrowful murmur that reminds me of the woman in black who once stood at the edge of the forest. It is a sound both comforting and haunting, a reminder that the past, though painful, can lead to a new beginning if we dare to open the door and let the truth in. I am David Rowan, 38 years old, and my time in Wildcat Hollow changed me forever. It taught me that redemption lies not in forgetting our mistakes, but in facing them, acknowledging our guilt, and finding the strength to move forward. As I continue on my journey, I carry with me the quiet understanding that some of the darkest paths can lead to the most unexpected light, and that even the most vengeful spirits of the forest can, in their own mysterious way, offer us a chance at healing. And so, every time I drive away from those haunted woods, I do so with a heart that has learned to forgive itself. A heart that, while scarred, beats with the promise of a new beginning. The echoes of that night, the spectral whispers of the forest, and the faint image of a woman in black remain with me, a testament to the fact that even in the face of unspeakable horror, there is always a path toward redemption, if only we dare to walk it. My name is Logan Maris, and I'm 43 years old. This happened in the fall of last year when I left behind a life filled with bitter memories and unanswered questions and set out to find solace in the isolation of Ohio's backcountry. I was once a satellite communications engineer, a job that taught me to trust in data and science, but after the day my world shattered with the death of my wife, I resigned and became a drifter. I now travel in a converted RV, hoping that the vast, indifferent wilderness might quiet the noise of my grief and perhaps even offer some long-sought answers. I pulled my RV onto a lonely gravel road known as Dead Horse Hollow Road, deep in the hills near Shawnee State Forest. The name alone sent shivers down my spine, echoing grim local legends. Stories of settlers' horses that had once thrown their riders off a cliff at dawn, leaving nothing behind but sorrow and unanswered questions. I had heard whispers that strange lights danced over the valley at night and that an inexplicable hum could sometimes be heard from deep underground. Locals avoided this place, calling it simply the Hollow, and I suppose there was reason for that. After parking at a cleared overlook far from any sign of civilization, I set up my modest camp. The RV, a weathered vehicle with more miles than I cared to count, was my sanctuary. A place where I could work on my old radio gear, take some night sky photos, and perhaps rekindle a spark of the rationality I once held dear. I set up a couple of antennas on the roof and dusted off a battered laptop that still carried remnants of my former career. I intended to scan the airwaves for anomalies, partly out of nostalgia, partly because I believed there was always a scientific explanation behind every oddity. That first evening, as twilight bled into night, I tuned my equipment to frequencies that I knew should be clear of interference. And then, amid the expected white static and mundane chatter, I caught it. A low, rhythmic tone, as if the night itself were breathing. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to any living creature. I assumed it was merely interference from some distant transmitter, or perhaps a quirk of my aging equipment. I recorded the tone, looping it, and made a note to analyze its waveform later. Later that night, I sat outside my RV beneath a canopy of stars. The cold air was crisp, and the silence was profound. Only the rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl punctuated the stillness. I played back the recording on my laptop. The tone was oddly hypnotic, a steady pulse that seemed to resonate with the very core of my being. As I adjusted the playback speed, I noticed faint modulations beneath the bass frequency, like hidden voices speaking in a language I couldn't decipher. I paused the recording and scribbled notes into my journal, trying to rationalize the sound. It had a quality that was almost alive. The next morning, I decided to explore a little further. I left the RV and drove along a narrow, winding trail that led into the heart of the forest. The landscape was both beautiful and eerie. The dense canopy filtered the early sunlight into a perpetual twilight, and mist clung to the ground like a living thing. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by unseen eyes. I passed an old caved-in mine shaft, its entrance partially obscured by overgrown brush. I paused there, the image of the shaft etched in my mind, and made a mental note to return later. There was something about that mine that resonated with the low tone I had recorded, a connection I couldn't quite explain. That night, back at my RV, I set my radio equipment to continuously monitor the strange frequency. As the darkness deepened, the tone returned, more pronounced now. I began experimenting, speaking into the microphone and watching the frequency's response on the laptop screen. To my astonishment, when I spoke, the tone modulated as if reacting to my voice. I heard my own words distorted and layered beneath the original hum. It was as though the signal was not just a passive interference, but an active presence. One that could manipulate the very sounds I produced. The deeper I listened, the more unnerved I became. I isolated a segment of the signal and slowed it down, revealing a faint murmur of voices beneath the persistent pulse. At first, they were indecipherable, like a garbled radio transmission from a distant past. But as I adjusted the frequencies, one voice emerged clearly, a voice that, despite the static, reminded me painfully of my wife's gentle tone. I shook my head, telling myself that grief was playing tricks on my mind, but the evidence was right there in the recording. Over the following days, the anomalies multiplied. My GPS began to act erratically, spinning in circles whenever I tried to navigate deeper into the forest. My compass needle wavered as if caught in an unseen magnetic field. And the tone. It was always there, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but never truly disappearing. I found myself compelled to investigate further, even as my rational mind warned me that there must be a scientific explanation. I reminded myself that I was a man of logic, not superstition. One afternoon, driven by a mixture of curiosity and an inexplicable pull, I returned to the old mine shaft I'd passed earlier. The entrance yawned before me, dark and silent. With a flashlight in hand, I ventured inside. The air was cool and damp, and my footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. I felt a prickle of unease as I descended a narrow passageway lined with rusted metal supports. Deep within, I discovered a hidden side tunnel, its entrance nearly obscured by fallen debris. The walls of the tunnel were smooth, unnaturally so, almost as if they had been carved rather than formed by natural decay. I set up a small recorder to capture any sounds and took a few cautious steps inside. For several minutes, nothing happened, except the sound of my own breathing. And then, deep in the tunnel, I heard it. The tone, resonating in the darkness, stronger and more insistent than ever before. My recorder picked up layers of sound, the bass frequency, now accompanied by what seemed to be whispers in a language I could not understand. I clutched my flashlight, my pulse racing, and realized that the signal might be emanating from deep within these tunnels. I quickly backed out, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd just encountered. Returning to my RV in a state of shaken disbelief, I reviewed the recordings from the tunnel. The data was unlike anything I had ever seen, a chaotic mix of sound and static that defied conventional analysis. I began to suspect that what I was dealing with was not a mere technical glitch, but something far more enigmatic. An ancient, non-human intelligence that communicated through frequencies. My scientific mind demanded evidence, but the overwhelming dread in my gut told me that some forces were not meant to be understood. That night, as I lay awake in the dim interior of my RV, I began to experience vivid dreams. In one, I saw my wife, her face illuminated by an otherworldly glow, standing at the edge of a vast, dark chasm. She reached out to me with eyes that were both sorrowful and accusing, and I could hear her whisper, "Come home, Logan." In another dream, I found myself lost in a labyrinth of corridors that twisted and warped, each turn accompanied by that relentless tone pulsing in the background. When I awoke, the remnants of these dreams clung to me like cobwebs, leaving me disoriented and haunted by a sense of impending doom. Over the next several days, I became increasingly obsessed with the signal. I spent long hours in front of my laptop, analyzing waveforms, plotting frequency modulations, and trying to decode the murmurs that lay beneath the hum. The boundaries between my waking life and the strange, distorted realm of the signal began to blur. I started to notice that the signal wasn't confined to my equipment. It seemed to seep into my thoughts, echoing in the quiet moments when I sat alone in the RV. At times, I could swear I heard it in the rustle of the wind, in the creaks of the old vehicle, in the distant howl of the forest. Late one night, as I was working on my analysis, I experienced a lapse in time. I remember sitting at my desk, eyes fixed on the screen, when suddenly the room went dark. My laptop had shut down on its own. I tried to reboot it, but the screen remained stubbornly black. When I finally managed to restart the machine, I discovered that several hours had passed, hours that I couldn't account for. In a daze, I found a series of scribbled notes in my journal, written in my own hand but in a style I did not recognize. The notes mentioned a cavern and a voice that promised understanding, hints that I was no longer the sole master of my own thoughts. I began to fear that the signal was not just an external phenomenon, but something that was invading my mind. I saw visions of impossible geometries, fractal patterns that twisted and reformed as if they were alive. At times, I caught fleeting images of a figure, a woman, impossibly beautiful yet haunting, with eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe. In brief moments of clarity, I recognized that figure as my wife, but distorted, as if her essence had been merged with something far beyond human comprehension. Driven by a mixture of terror and the need for answers, I resolved to return to the hidden tunnel in the mine. I needed to confront the source of the signal, to understand its nature and determine whether I could somehow resist its pull. I packed my gear, loaded my recorder, and, with a heavy heart and a mind racing with dread, set out for the mine once more. The journey back was a blur of shifting shadows and oppressive silence. The forest seemed to close in around me, the familiar trails transforming into a labyrinth of twisted branches and fog. I reached the entrance of the tunnel, its dark mouth yawning open as if inviting me to step into another world. With only the beam of my flashlight to guide me, I descended into the depths. The walls of the tunnel were colder now, the smooth surfaces reflecting a strange, iridescent light that seemed to pulse in time with the tone I had recorded so many times before. As I ventured deeper, the sound of the signal grew louder, filling the space with a dissonant symphony of low frequencies and ghostly whispers. My recorder captured every moment, every modulation of the sound, and I could feel the vibrations in my very bones. Time lost meaning in that subterranean void. Minutes or hours, I couldn't tell which, passed in a haze of disorientation. I began to see shapes moving in the corners of my vision, figures that melted into the darkness as soon as I tried to focus on them. Then, in a vast chamber deep within the tunnel, I came upon something that defied all logic. A natural cavern that looked as though it had been sculpted by an unseen hand. The walls were adorned with strange symbols and patterns, etched so finely that they almost glowed with an inner light. In the center of the chamber, the source of the tone was unmistakable. An ancient device, or perhaps a formation of rock and crystal, emitting the eerie frequency in a steady, relentless pulse. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, and reached out a trembling hand to touch the cool surface. At that moment, the signal surged. My recorder, my laptop back at the RV, even my own thoughts, all were overpowered by the overwhelming presence of the tone. I felt it seep into me, an insidious force that filled the spaces between my thoughts, replacing my rational mind with fragments of alien impressions. I began to understand, not in words, but in raw sensations, that this signal was a form of communication, a message from something ancient and indifferent to human suffering. It was a message that spoke of hunger, of echoing voids, of a desire to assimilate and transform. In a final, desperate bid to break free of its pull, I forced myself to turn away from the source and flee back toward the entrance of the cavern. I ran blindly through the twisting passages, the sound of the signal still echoing in my ears, mingling with my ragged breaths. The labyrinth of tunnels became a maddening maze, and I lost track of direction as the line between reality and hallucination blurred further. Every step was a struggle against the disintegration of my mind. Every sound a reminder of the cosmic horror that was slowly consuming me. I emerged from the tunnel in a state of near delirium. The forest outside looked unchanged, yet I knew that something fundamental had shifted inside me. I drove my RV with trembling hands, my eyes darting to every shadow on the roadside, as if expecting the signal to follow me even here. I recorded a final journal entry that night, a desperate, disjointed attempt to capture the truth before it all faded away. I wrote of the signal's unfathomable nature, of the impossible geometries and the voice that whispered of assimilation, and of the creeping realization that my mind was no longer entirely my own. In those final hours, as I sat alone in the dim light of my RV, I could no longer tell if the tone was coming from the radio, from the darkness outside the window, or from within my very being. I felt a coldness spreading through me, a numbness that promised oblivion. I knew then that the signal had done what it was meant to do. It had seeped into my soul, erasing the boundaries between my past and the cosmic unknown. I attempted to drive away from Dead Horse Hollow, to leave behind the horrors that I had witnessed, but even as the RV rumbled along the empty road, I realized with mounting dread that I was not free. Every now and then, in the dead silence of the night, I heard the faint, relentless tone, a reminder that the signal had followed me home, that it was now part of me. My recordings later revealed nothing concrete, just layers of static and the occasional, barely audible whisper that seemed to mimic my own thoughts. There was a moment, as I passed a small abandoned gas station on the outskirts of a town, when I saw something in the rearview mirror that made my blood run cold. For just a fleeting second, the screen captured a blurry image. A woman's figure, indistinct and impossibly distant, standing in the trees. I blinked and she was gone. But the image, that final frame, haunted me. A lingering proof that the signal's influence extended far beyond the tunnels and the mountains. It was as if the entire landscape had become a canvas for an ancient, unknowable force, one that had reached out and left its mark on me. Now, as I continued to drive along these empty roads with my RV, I struggled to piece together what remains of my sanity. My scientific mind, once so confident in the power of reason and technology, is now clouded by the inexorable pull of a cosmic message that I can neither fully comprehend nor escape. I no longer ask for answers, only that I might find a way to resist the encroaching madness, to hold on to the faint hope that I am still in control of my own destiny. I keep my old radio equipment close, not as a tool for study, but as a reminder of that relentless tone, a reminder that the universe holds secrets that no human mind was meant to decipher. And though I drive away from Dead Horse Hollow, its ghostly signal follows me like a shadow, a constant echo in the chambers of my heart and mind. I now record these words in the hope that, if anyone ever stumbles upon my notes, they might understand the peril of chasing down that which lies beyond the veil of human comprehension. The signal is not a simple phenomenon, but a living, ancient force that defies the very notion of time and space. It speaks not in words, but in frequencies, a cosmic whisper that seeps into your soul and leaves you forever changed. My nights are filled with the hum of that tone, sometimes so soft I wonder if it's just the wind, and sometimes so loud that I cannot escape its presence even in my dreams. I remember the moment in that cavern, the sensation of cold, alien energy coursing through me, and the final realization that my mind was no longer entirely my own. That was the day I understood that some mysteries are better left unsolved, that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. I am Logan Maris, a man who once trusted in the certainties of science, only to find that the cosmos has a language all its own, a language that, once heard, can drive even the most rational mind to the brink of madness. As I drive along these empty highways, I am haunted by the thought that I am now merely a conduit for an ancient, indifferent force. And every so often, when the night is silent and the road stretches out like an endless promise of oblivion, I can almost hear that low, rhythmic tone pulsing in time with my heartbeat, a reminder that I will never be truly free. I write these words now as a testament to the dangers of curiosity, to the price of uncovering truths that lie hidden in the dark recesses of the earth. The signal has become a part of me, an unyielding presence that whispers of cosmic indifference and the ultimate futility of human understanding. I can only hope that in sharing my story, I might warn others away from venturing too deep into the unknown. Yet, even as I finish this final journal entry, I cannot shake the feeling that the signal is still speaking, softly, insidiously, in a language beyond words. And as I watch the road recede behind me in the rearview mirror, I glimpse for just a split second a blurry figure in the trees. A woman, perhaps, or something else entirely. I cannot be sure. All I know is that the tone is with me, always, a ceaseless echo of the abyss that now claims a part of my soul. I am Logan Maris, and my journey into the heart of Dead Horse Hollow has changed me irreversibly. I once believed that every mystery could be solved with reason and science. Now I understand that some enigmas are as vast and unknowable as the cosmos itself, and that the cost of knowing may be far greater than any price I could have ever imagined. And so I drive on, into the uncertain night, carrying with me the echoes of an ancient signal that will forever haunt the quiet moments between my thoughts, an eternal reminder that the universe is full of mysteries that no mortal mind can ever truly comprehend.